This panel on religious people's secular nation toward a new wall of separation is going to be moderated by one of our own, as all of these are, Chris Meserole, who's a student here at Yale Divinity School. He's also founder of Thinker Media and editor of Democratic Vista. And he is the person who has created our website. I encourage you to visit it afterwards because there will be postings on the website from some of our speakers, hopefully all of our speakers, and I also want to encourage those of you who are students here at Yale that we meet regularly every week. And if you want to be part of getting the notices on that, we encourage all of you to sign in the back and put your emails, but especially note if you want to be included with information about our meetings. So over to Chris.
Thanks, Linda, for that introduction. You just heard about theological engagements, in the theological foundations for political engagements. What I want to do now is shift the subject more to church-state relations. And as a way of framing this, I want to go back to the 1802 letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to the Baptists of nearby Danbury, Connecticut. In that letter, which is famous for this one phrase of the wall of separation between church and state. For the 205 years ever since, Americans have debated what exactly that phrase means. What I want to talk about for this panel is what that phrase means today and how it might have changed over the last few years. And to start out, I'm going to ask just to give you a sense of the format of the panel, we're going to have three perspectives from Rabbi Saperstein, Ralph Reed, and Norm Ornstein. Then we're going to have 20 minutes of conversation and back and forth on more perspectives, challenging the perspectives that we've heard from the first three panelists. And then we're going to have 20 more minutes talking about the 2008 elections coming up. So right now I'd like to turn it over to Rabbi Saperstein. It is a tremendous privilege and honor to have you with us here today. In addition to your clerical work, you've taught at Georgetown Law School and also served as the first chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Yet you're perhaps most well known as the director of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism. As a result of your work for the RAC, the Washington Post once even described you as the quintessential religious lobbyist on Capitol Hill. So, given that you've spent so much of your career at the very intersection of church and state, my first question is fairly simple. What does Jefferson's wall of separation mean to you today, and how has that meaning changed over the past few years?
First, you did not point out that that was a quote from my mother in that article. You know, for Jews, America has been an extraordinary country. The revolutionary genius of the three religious provisions of the Constitution, no religious test for office, separation, no law respecting the establishment of religion, free exercise of religion, created for the first time in human history a nation in which your rights, your freedoms, your opportunities as a citizen would never depend upon your religious practices or identity. What a difference this was for Jews who have been victimized by this kind of by religious persecution throughout our history. To a great extent, there is an element of the religious right in America that's foisted a myth on America, that somehow Jefferson's separation of church and state is anti-God or anti-religion. Nothing could be further from the truth. It is precisely that wall that has kept government out of religion, that has allowed religion to flourish with a diversity and strength in America unmatched anywhere in a democratic world. Far, far more people going regularly to worship, far more people believing in God, far more people holding religious values central to their lives. That for the sake of a bowl of porridge, for the money that comes from the government or the government's stamp of approval, we would abandon that in the name of religion. What a paradox that would be. And the last thing we need is to see an America in which we fight over who will get the government money, whose prayer will be said in the government function, whose religious symbol or message will be erected on the government wall, bringing us down the path of the kind of sectarian divisiveness that's tearing so many other countries across the globe apart. So for me, that that separation of church and state has been at the core of what has made America great and what has given Jews more freedoms and other religious minorities more freedoms, more rights, more opportunities than we've known anywhere else in our history.
Thank you for that. Moving on to Ralph Reed. Again, it's a pleasure to have you with us here. Currently, you're the head of Century Strategies, and prior to that, you served as executive director of the Christian Coalition. Mr. Reed, to frame my question to you, I'd like to refer first to John Meacham's op-ed in this past Sunday's New York Times. At the close of the op-ed, Meacham recalls how in the 1790s, as pirates were seizing American ships off the North African coast, President Washington sent Joel Bartlow to Tripoli. Article 11 of the resulting treaty, Meacham notes, says that as the government of the United States is not, in any sense, founded on the Christian religion, there should be no cause for conflict over differences of religious opinion between countries. The treaty, Meacham then points out, passed the Senate unanimously. My question to you is, what does it mean that the U.S. Senate acknowledged that America was not in any sense a Christian nation? Or put differently, what does it mean that the U.S. government is, in some sense, a secular, non-religious institution?
Well, I think what it means is that the U.S. Senate, I'd have to research the treaty, but my sense is that it meant that the United States did not have an official church or an established religion. That was certainly the way the founders understood it. I don't think that evangelicals get enough credit on this point, because the separation of church and state, while some might quarrel with the term, it's a relatively inexact term. Others would say no establishment of religion, which is what the First Amendment actually says, is not only a uniquely American idea, it's a uniquely evangelical idea. It emerged when Baptists in colonial Virginia insisted on the disestablishment of the Anglican Church because they were being forced to pay taxes to propagate a theology with which they disagreed. So it is to the evangelicals that we owe this. That was the origin, if you read Reese Isaac's book on colonial Virginia, that was the origin of the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, which became the genesis of the First Amendment. What it does not mean is that expressions of non-sectarian faith in public settings should be excluded from our civic discourse. We have In God We Trust on our coins. We have One Nation Under God in the Pledge of Allegiance. The Northwest Ordinance called for the propagation of the Christian gospel, direct quote. I'm not sure we would go along with that law today. We have paid chaplains in the military and so forth. So my view of it is no established church, no use of taxes to propagate a particular theology or church. But I think that sound public policy that strengthens family, marriage, helps the poor and the marginalized and the dispossessed, that is informed by faith, is not only entirely legitimate and doesn't violate the separation of church and state. I think it should be celebrated, and I think it should be welcomed.
Thank you for that. Moving along to Norman Ornstein. He is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and author of several books on Congress. Mr. Ornstein, my question for you has to do with the fact that congressmen and congresswomen serve only a 2-year term, and the result of that is they are famous for, Congress as an institution is famous for being the most representative branch of government, the most representative of the American people. But if the American people, who are also famous for being so religious, which Rabbi Saperstein already articulated, how does Congress as an institution remain secular while also reflecting the religiosity of its constituents?
Chris, first I want to start with an apology. If my phone goes off while I'm talking, I'm expecting a call from the wife. Not my wife, but Rudy Giuliani's wife. And I'm not sure which wife. So
Apology accepted.
But the answer to your question is Congress grapples with this on a regular basis, and we almost always have stories of the controversy. We've just been through one in the last week where more than 200 members of Congress called for the head of the architect of the Capitol because policy of the architect, apparently set off by a different controversy, said that they would take out the word God from a certificate sent by a member of Congress with a flag that had flown over the Capitol that was dedicated to a person for service to God and country. It was, frankly, into the realm of the absurd, and the realm of the absurd that the architect of the Capitol would be so obtuse, since this was not something that went out with every flag flown over the Capitol of the United States as policy of the Congress. It was a private certificate going to an individual getting these flags, which are flown for a nanosecond over the Capitol. They go up and down all day long and get sent out to people. But, of course, it was a policy set basically because somebody had complained earlier that it had been sent to them, a certificate with God in it. So they decided they wanted to stay out of controversy and embroil themselves in it. We started at the beginning of this Congress. Now the architect has backed off and the policy's been changed, and presumably he'll keep his job for a while until we get the next cost overrun in the Capitol Visitor Center. We started this Congress with the first Muslim in Congress who wanted to take his oath on the Koran, which caused enormous controversy. Again, a faux controversy, because basically all members of Congress are sworn in together, and then they go back to their offices and have a little private swearing-in ceremony in which they can basically be sworn in on whatever they want to be sworn in on. It's more of a symbol than anything else. That controversy presumably ended when he said that he would actually be sworn in on Thomas Jefferson's copy of the Koran from the Library of Congress, which tended to stifle the debate right then and there. But it's fairly obvious that it touched a nerve, and a nerve once again about the role of Congress. I got tangentially involved in an earlier controversy because, of course, in Congress we have chaplains. We have a prayer that starts every day. God and religion are ever present in the Congress on a daily basis. But a former student of mine, one of my better students at Catholic University, a Catholic priest and also a political science professor, was picked by a committee to be the chaplain of the House of Representatives, and then was not approved by the House. And there were some suggestions made, this was going to be the first Catholic chaplain, that his religion had some role in this. Now, ultimately, they picked another Catholic priest to be the chaplain. But again, it showed the sensitivity, in this case, not to whether there would be a chaplain. There's always been a chaplain. There always will be a chaplain. We'll start every session of Congress with a prayer, usually done by a different religious figure. But the question of whether or not there was going to be a bias towards or against one religion or another. And I think it's a reflection of these larger controversies that we face in a society that was not founded on Christian principles, although keep in mind that presidential candidate John McCain stumbled just a week ago by talking about how we were founded on Christian principles and favoring a constitutional amendment, first introduced actually by John Anderson when he was in the House of Representatives, reflecting our beginnings as a Christian nation. Not everybody understands this off the top, but as David said, separating church and state doesn't mean we don't have religious principles, and doesn't mean that we don't have currency that says, in God we trust, and doesn't mean we don't have a chaplain and we don't have religion. It reflects very different things, and sometimes members of Congress, no matter what they take the oath on, aren't quite clear on what those principles are.
Thank you very much for that. At this point, I'd like to ask for some responses to what we've heard. We've heard three perspectives here, some great perspectives. Laying out the religious diversity of America, the religious vitality of America. We've learned about, from Mr. Reed, about the evangelical influence in the very separation of church and state. And we've also heard about Congress and the way that Congress negotiates the religiosity and the religiosity of its constituency and the secularism of it as an institution. I want now to kind of move into a more free-flowing conversation about what we've heard and applying it to the American culture today and how it understands the division between church and state, which is somewhat different, but I want to get a sense of, is this understanding different today than it was even 10 years ago? when, for instance, I was in junior high. I'll tip my hat here a little bit about my age, but I was in junior high when the moral majority took control of Congress, the Christian Coalition, and I'm wondering, as that has changed, and they're no longer, but in the 2006 midterm elections, Democrats are back in power. With that, is there a new understanding of how the church and state should intersect? And so I guess I'll start with Professor Gorski, who's a wonderful professor here of sociology, and get your perspective on that question.
About how church and state should intersect.
Not how it should, but on your perception of how it does intersect, and your perception of how Americans today understand it to intersect.
Well, I guess what's on my mind actually at the moment most are the reflections about this notion of America being a Christian nation, which I actually find to be extremely troubling. I find it quite honestly to be something which, in my view, is really quite difficult to defend in terms of Christian theology, and yet it's something which is remarkably widespread. I mean, the fact that John McCain recently felt that invoking this phrase would be a way that he could sort of reach out to a constituency in an effort to kind of shore up his sagging campaign. And I think I would also add, I think it's one of the things that makes it really such a sort of insidious metaphor, not just theologically but politically, has to do with the different meanings that are attached to the nation, which can be the term nation, which can kind of be so that you can play with this on a variety of different registers. So nation can mean something like a community of biological descent. That's what it means etymologically. It can mean also, in a very ancient meaning, a group of people who share a common language and culture. There is then, of course, the very important biblical meaning, not something which is originally in the Hebrew Old Testament, rather comes in through the Vulgate in the translation, which introduces the term nation, which implies this notion of sort of sacredness and chosenness, and introduces the notion that there is some kind of close connection between people, territory, and religion. And then, to some degree, coming out of that, very much influenced by that Hebrew notion, is the notion that nations are things which have to have states. And the reason that I find this phrase so insidious is that when it's invoked and critiqued, people will sort of immediately move back to the minimalist definition. Well, we're just saying the majority of the population is Christian, which is an incontrovertible fact. But when speaking to other audiences, all these other registers are played on with all of the kind of sort of aspirations to sort of power, to cultural uniformity, that in that sense I find, even implying in a sense that the polity itself, that the people who are themselves sort of the constituted people of America are themselves somehow inherently or exclusively Christian. And for all those reasons, I find this extremely, extremely troubling.
Seamus Hasson, you are founder of the Becket Fund, which promotes religious freedom throughout the world. How would you answer Professor Gorski's response?
Quick word of apology. You might notice that I'm shaking. This is not because I'm afraid of you or afraid of Professor Gorski. It's because I'm afraid of Chris. Actually, this is the only thing that Michael J. Fox and I have in common. Parkinson's is good for some things. I make a great martini now that I have Parkinson's. But public speaking isn't exactly one of them, so bear with me. I wonder if in between the notion that there is a separation of church and state and the notion on the other, rigid separation of church and state, and the notion on the other end of the spectrum that there is an official religion, there isn't a question of religion and culture. And I wonder if the time isn't ripe in America to realize that religion in public culture should look a lot like ethnicity and race in public culture, both as a legal matter under the Equal Protection Clause in the 14th Amendment and the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, And as a social matter, the standard for government distinctions among religions is identical to the standard for government distinctions among races and ethnicities. Nevertheless, March 17th passes in peace for me every year without Anglophiles suing to block St. Patrick's Day parades as Irish supremacist plots. February passes in peace every year without European Americans suing to enjoin African American History Month as a racist power grab. But Christmas and Hanukkah every year by busy seasons, as everyone is trying to get the nativity scene of the menorah off the courthouse steps. Why should that be? I mean, we don't deal with diversity in America by pretending we're all male. We don't deal with diversity in America by pretending we're all white. We don't deal with it by pretending we're all Irish. Why should we deal with diversity by pretending we're all agnostic? For exactly the same reason that we allow the nativity scene or the St. Patrick's Day parade in Irish America or the African American History Month, we should allow the nativity scene in the menorah and realize it's just a simple part of the diversity of our various cultures and grow up. What do you think, David?
Reverend Nathan, I'd like to turn to you now. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't hear what you said.
Two simple points. One is, I think for better, perhaps you think for worse, religion is treated distinctly in the Constitution, founded out of a history that had seen enormous brutality and injustice because of the linkage of government and religion. The founders began the recitation of our most fundamental rights with the statement that the government shall make no law, Congress shall make no law even respecting an establishment of religion. So it is treated differently by the founders, treated differently by our fundamental documents. Then the second thing is, well, should it be? And to a large extent, I think the answer to that is yes. First of all, we, the religious community, get enormous benefits out of the fact that this exists. We have all kinds of special exemptions, protections, precisely because we're not treated like everyone else. And we can't have our cake and eat it too and say, when it comes to getting the money, just treat us like everyone else, but then allow us all these legal exemptions and protections and special status things that allow us to discriminate in ways that others can't do, and it makes us free of all kinds of government reporting that others are subject to, et cetera. So I think we go down a dangerous road when we pursue those things. But this is also an extraordinarily religiously diverse country. The sociologists tell us, Phil, that there are 2,000 religious denomination sects and faith groups in the United States. And yes, I know what you're all thinking, 1,900 of them are in California. Nonetheless,
There are 2,000 in Judaism alone.
Yeah, touche. Nonetheless, we are in some ways very different than other kinds of groups are in America, and it is a very dangerous kind of thing to have these sectarian battles over religious things. And bear in mind, going on longer than I should have, I want to make one other really essential point. There's a huge difference between the government square and the public square. There are no limitations on the public square. Unless you live in a different America than I do, the public square I see is filled with religion, not just during Christmas, not just during Easter, not just during Hanukkah, but almost every day of the week, with the airways filled and the televisions filled and the music filled and the bookshelves filled with books on religion. This is an extraordinarily... It is only the limited government square that we say has to be neutral on religion. I think that's a good thing. Good for religion, good for government, good for our fundamental freedoms.
Thanks. I actually do want to turn to Reverend Nathan now, for very much the same reasons. Let me just throw a hypothetical to you, where you have a congregant in your church who comes to you and says, and just expresses the frustration that they have, say, about the fact that they can't put a Christmas tree in, the town square, or they can't put the Ten Commandments in the courthouse. How do you as a pastor, so this is from a slightly different side of the question, how do you as a pastor answer that congregant? What would you say to them about the separation of church and state from a religious perspective, within a religious context?
Well, my knee-jerk would be to tell them to grow up, but my concern is not in attempting to assert Christian prerogatives as a Christian, so that the main thrust of our congregation in its witness to the community is not how can we gain more rights vis-a-vis the community by aggressively promoting our posture. Rather, we really do approach the community in Columbus by way of service. And in that way, I've seen the wall breaking down in the other direction. That is, we are regularly approached by government to assist with a whole variety of things. So in my community, for example, the school system has come to our church and said, look, you guys have a huge English as a second language program. You also are doing an after-school program. We've run out of money. Can we send you 500 of our kids so that you would take care of them in the summer? Because you've already got 500 kids. Will you take another 500 kids and tutor them in the summer? You've got a program for recovery. Can we send some of our parents that we know are abusing alcohol or drugs or so on to your church? And in that way, the fear factor, at least I'm not sure that I would be in agreement with David on that side of things. I see a much healthier sort of partnership going on that really is not destructive of religion or destructive of the neutrality of the state. Rather, there really is a growing, confidence on both sides that we can work together without destroying each other or destroying religion. So I would always encourage congregants to just say, for something like a Christmas tree, this does not bear witness to Christ, but I'll tell you what will bear witness to Christ, this act of service will.
David Kuo, since you actually have served in the Office of Faith-Based Initiatives under President Bush, do you have any thoughts or comments on the way that the public sphere and our public institutions can approach churches to work together?
I think one of the things that always fascinated me in being part of the faith-based initiative was a sort of a reflexive reaction against the faith-based initiative from Democrats who had been inadvertently or advertently voting for those or funding those faith-based charities for decades. You go and you look at communities like the United Jewish Communities. They get about $5 billion a year in public funding and have for a very long time. Catholic Charities, same thing, more than $3 billion a year. Lutheran Social Services, more than $1.5 billion a year in terms of public funds. And so it was always this bemusement, I suppose, to see a reaction against these charities just because a Republican proposed it in the form of President Bush, even though Vice President Gore had proposed exactly the same sort of thing. And so that's one reaction to it. The other reaction is almost a greater concern for me, and that is the degree to which the state is invading the church. And I don't mean that in terms of literally invading, with laws, but sort of what Yale law professor David Galerner terms Americanism, sort of a national religion called Americanism, is invading the church. Whether you have American flags or whether you have, celebration of the 4th of July or the general celebration of American nationalism, that is invading a lot of churches, and that is something that I find disturbing, just because of the biblical admonitions against exactly that sort of thing occurring.
Thanks. I'm going to switch subjects a little bit here and introduce Amy Sullivan, who's with us. She's the political editor at Time Magazine. And my question would be, well, let me put it this way. A few weeks ago, or maybe it was a couple months ago, the Time cover was, how the Democrats get religion. And I'm wondering, when it comes to their understanding of how, or what the wall of separation between church and state means to them, how is that different than how the Republicans get religion?
Yeah, I would point out that the headline for that piece was "Leveling the Praying Field," which is one of my favorite puns, come up with one of my colleagues. So I've stolen it for part of my book, actually. But it's a good question because in some senses, folks on the left, and particularly I think the religious left has learned more of a lesson than the Democratic Party necessarily has yet, have an excellent cautionary tale for them in the religious right and the marriage between the Republican Party and many religious conservatives over the last few decades. I think I hear this particularly from activists in more progressive religious circles, that they want to make sure that they are not taken for granted by the Democratic Party the same way they feel their brothers and sisters on the right have been by Republicans. So there's much more of a conscious awareness of that within, I think, religious circles than there is in Democratic Party circles. And there, you I think, often hear people who, while they are quick to say that Jesus is not a Republican, how dare you say that, will claim that Jesus would have been a Democrat. And think that, but of course the policies are on our side. Of course he would have supported universal health care and more education funding and would be against the war. And while you can argue yes or no for policies one way or another, I think it should be the place of all people of faith to say that Jesus would not have been partisan at all. In fact, Jim Wallace's campaign that God is not a Republican or a Democrat is, I think, probably along the right lines. I think Democrats, and I would put in their Republican colleagues with this, could use just some basic education about the separation of church and state. Referring to what David was mentioning, I think a lot of that comes from a total ignorance about what separation of church and state really means, that for a long time now it's kind of been used as a reflexive response that Democrats give when they're asked to talk about faith. They would say, oh, well, I would love to get into that, but we do have separation of church and state in this country, and therefore I can't even talk about religion, which is obviously not what separation of church and state is. And with enough years of that, it's become code to voters of, whoa, I really don't want to deal with religion. And we've gotten away from the actual serious, important issues involved with that principle. And I would say on the other side, Ralph's exactly right, that, my own tradition growing up, the Baptist Church, the Baptists have been among some of the greatest proponents of separation of church and state. And yet, when I read articles about voters in Iowa these days, I'm always chagrined to hear comments like the one I read a couple of weeks ago, where a man was talking about why he supported Huckabee because he was an evangelical, this man himself. And he had friends who were Catholics, and so, of course, they were supporting Giuliani. And then, I believe it was Brownback, the Catholics were supporting. And then he assumed that the Mormon voters would support Romney. And it was all based on this identity politics of, I want somebody in that office who is of my faith. And that is the highest priority. And after that would just be a person of faith. And that this is intricately tied up with what they're looking at in terms of qualifications. For who they're voting for. There's nothing wrong with taking into account somebody's personal faith, but to base your support on a person's sectarian affiliation, I think, is getting far, far away from our Baptist forefathers.
Thanks. Norm Ornstein, as you've watched Congress transition to now a Democratic-controlled Congress, how would you assess Amy's statements? What would your response be?
Well, to start with, Chris, it's really interesting in this presidential campaign to see where the real trouble with religion is coming on the Republican side in a host of ways. John McCain, who is no bigot, is clearly having difficulty with questions that you wouldn't think a veteran presidential candidate or any veteran figure on the national stage would have difficulty with. We used to think of this in terms of, I think the problem that the Democratic Party had as much as anything, which gets to some of the code things that Amy was talking about, is it was seen as a secular party. And in a country which is a religious country, where you have I think it's going to be far more difficult to imagine an atheist becoming president than a woman, an African American, a Hispanic, or almost any other figure that you can imagine. And the secular community, which is a very active one, is still probably only about 10% of the population. But now with Mitt Romney, a religious figure, different even from Joe Lieberman, where he always got substantial support from the evangelical community in Connecticut and got it in his vice presidential campaign because he was an Orthodox Jew, but he was a religious person. Mitt Romney, as a religious person, is going to have far more difficulty, and it remains a huge elephant in the elephant's room. Of course, it's the great irony that of the major candidates, the Mormon's the one with one wife. But that's a big problem. And Rudy Giuliani now is finding that one of the banes of his existence is the Archbishop of St. Louis, who 4 years ago was the bane in John Kerry's life. It's going to be a very, very interesting dynamic. The one Republican candidate who remains to me by far the most interesting, Mike Huckabee, is the one who is able, as Bill Clinton was, to tie his religion and principles together with a public policy in a way that brings out the best of religion combined with public policy, but also, it seems to me, has a very clear understanding of where the one stops and the other starts. And this time the Democrats don't have as much, at least on the surface, of a religion problem. And I don't see, as a consequence, partly in Congress, other than these controversies that I talked about, which are not really party-based particularly, they haven't even had to grapple much with these issues, at least up to this point. Now, they might be grappling with them a little bit more if you had a president at a 60% approval rating instead of at a 29% approval rating, and maybe some of those programs that gained controversy, partly because they were implemented by a Republican president and faith-based initiatives, were undergoing scrutiny and oversight, but they're not. We've got a lot of other things that are undergoing oversight, and the Justice Department's activities had nothing to do with religion.
All right, with that, I'd like to transition to the presidential part of this discussion, or the 2008 elections discussion. Again, with a hypothetical here, Eric Sapp, you are a Democratic consultant. If the Democratic nominee came to you and approached you about working with them, how would your understanding of church and state inform that work?
Hypothetically, if they came to talk to us, I would start by saying it is a very good time to be a Democrat right now. I mean, everything is going in their favor. And on this particular issue of the faith in the public square, though, I think the party has learned a great deal. And partly they've learned that from some of the mistakes that have been referred to that have been made by the religious right, and that we're seeing them, eating their own in the Republican Party because they use religion as a wedge issue more times than not, and as a heavily judgmental. Not that there is judgment in the Bible, but that when that is the primary way that you are communicating it, at some point it is doomed to implode on itself and turn in on itself. And so what Democrats have started to do is address this more from a place of religious humility and speak about it in a personal sense, where they are communicating their own values, which I think on this question of church-state is a different conversation from, is this a Christian nation, versus I myself am a Christian, and the reason I come to these policies is because of my faith, and that in no way violates any constitutional norms. And it's a simple argument of, why in the world have Democrats been saying it's okay to say, I support this policy because Gloria Steinem said it or because Kant supports it, but God forbid I mention that I support this policy because Jesus said so? If you're going to be totally secular in your approach, that would seem to be a rational way to come at it. And what you've seen with at least the top tier of Democrats now is talking authentically, and it has to be authentic. I mean, if you're changing your denomination depending on the group you're talking to, that is going to come back and bite you. But in this election, you have Democrats at the top that are people of faith, that have grown up in these traditions, that can talk authentically about it and are saying, this is how my faith informs my policies. And therefore, as a voter, when you're trying to decide, do I trust this person with an unforeseen 4 years coming, they get a better idea of why you believe what you believe, who you truly are, and if you can represent them in the next 4 years.
If I could jump in and maybe just sort of push back on that perspective for just a second. I mean, all I can say is enjoy it while you can, because eventually there are going to be two nominees. Don't make the mistake of watching the intramural struggle within a party and think that energy and that vinegar means they're not going to be united in the fall. I remember when we made that mistake with Clinton. Remember, I think it was Time Magazine, it may have been Newsweek, put Clinton on the cover, reverse negative, and his negatives were so I'm just saying we don't hold presidential elections a year and 2 months out. I also totally disagree with the idea that conservative people of faith, their voting behavior is driven by identity politics. I think the record is clear that actually it's the opposite. They voted against one of the most explicitly evangelical political figures of the 20th century, Jimmy Carter, to elect the first divorced man to ever sit in the office, who said, "We don't use the phrase born again in my church," and didn't attend church on Sunday. If they had been driven by identity politics, they would have voted for Carter over Reagan. They didn't. They vote the same way every other American votes. I'm not going to deny there are exceptions. I mean, the quote you cited, Amy, I'm sure there are people who say that, but it's not a majority view. Remember, if they were driven by identity politics, Mike Huckabee would be leading among that group. He's not. Among social conservatives right now, a thrice divorced Catholic is leading in most polls, including the ABC News Washington Post poll. What conservative people of faith look for in their voting decision is the same thing everybody else looks for. They agree with me on the issues, they share my values, and they're uniquely qualified to lead. And when you get to a general election, if you have a Democratic nominee who was against the Supreme Court upholding the partial birth abortion ban, says the Defense of Marriage Act was a mistake and should be repealed, and favors large spending and tax increases, I think you'll see a breakdown of the faith-based vote, not that much different than it was in 2000 and 2004. If you look at the most recent Public Opinion Strategies poll, Rudy Giuliani is leading Hillary Clinton, just in that hypothetical matchup, among self-identified religious conservatives, which is about a quarter of the electorate, 69-19. That's 2 points within the margin that Bush beat Kerry. So, we'll see what happens. I'm not in the prediction business. But,
Eric, would you like to respond?
I think this idea that this vote is somehow out there wandering around and is not held up by the data.
Can I have Eric go and then David Quill?
Take 30 seconds. I'll go after Eric.
Just real quickly, I think you're right. If Democrats used your framing, which I will give you all credit for having been very effective at doing, you'd see some of those outcomes. I think what's changed and what communicating the values allows them to do is reframe this discussion and not just have to have the discussion based on the 3 issues that are chosen that pit them against some of these people. And obviously they don't have to win they don't have to win every single voter in this country either.
Sure.
I just want to say 2 quick things. The first is I certainly didn't mean to say that all evangelicals vote based on identity, so I misspoke. But it is the case that in 2000 and very much in 2004, the Bush-Cheney campaign ran a campaign emphasizing Bush's personal faith and emphasizing him even more as an evangelical, a man who very rarely attends church. I would not presume to judge his faith, and you can certainly be a very strong person of faith without attending church. But the 2004 convention included testimonies from people, and included some of my favorite Christian rock groups, Third Day, and Michael W. Smith performing. And it was very much like one of the Baptist...
We also had Kid Rock.
All right. It was a big tent.
That's the party that they did.
But I would argue that that's something that some Republicans have pushed, whether or not evangelicals react that way. That is something that has been encouraged, is to think of a person's faith when you're voting for them. The other thing is that I agree when it gets down to two nominees is a different story. But what I think Eric was getting at is that traditionally we've had Republicans assumed to be religious and Democrats assumed to be secular. And that was the conventional wisdom even among Democrats themselves. And that's changing this year. And that means a whole different ballgame, I think. Because even if you get down to the position level and you've got folks who are just one issue abortion voters and say, I can't go with that person, there are people a level up who are pro-life but say, you know what, the way Hillary Clinton talks about wanting to reduce the abortion rate turns out to be the exact same language Rudy Giuliani uses about how to reduce the abortion rate. And that kind of evens out for me. So then I go on to other issues, which I would argue, haven't seen in a good 30 years.
David Cole, you
I
had...
could just jump in for a second. I'm going to challenge my friend Ralph for just a second and ask if I think it's pretty clear that if your Reagan-Carter analogy holds, which it clearly does, that one of the reasons that President Bush was elected in 2000 was as a revolt against the perceived moral failings of President Clinton. And it was very explicit in his campaign in 2000. I mean, his faith was extraordinarily played up in 2000, both in terms of sort of, the way pastors were recruited, the way his faith was talked about. And he definitely was elected in part as a rejection of President Clinton. And that identity politics of his evangelical faith, as Amy talked about, was certainly played up in 2004 from what I hear. And don't you think that in 2008, if Senator Clinton is the nominee, there will be again this rush to have an identity politics, to have the Republican nominee play up his evangelical faith, to build on that same evangelical perception against President Clinton that occurred in 2000?
No, I really don't. Look, there's two real simple rules. You run as who you are. I get a big kick, actually, having been involved in both campaigns from the beginning, about this reference to the playing up of the president's faith, because I was involved in writing the direct mail pieces that went to evangelicals. And I can assure you, that the strategy was tell him where he stands on the issues. I could show you the mail pieces. Okay, it wasn't a picture of George W. Bush with his wife and children, and the quote is, Jesus lives in my heart. It was, here's where I stand on the issues. And then a contrast with the other candidates. All I'm saying, I think it's kind of obvious, but I think it's so simple it needs to be underscored. If I share your faith, but I don't share your values or your stands on the issues, you're not going to vote for me. Jew, Christian, Muslim, Hindu. Voters do not vote for candidates who go to the same church they do, but don't stand with them on the issues, and they don't share their values. And so if George W. Bush, look, the reason why he talked about it was because it was who he was. It was authentic. That's why he did it. Anybody who knows him knows.
Norm, do you agree with that?
Huh?
Norm.
Well, put the direct mail aside, George W. Bush campaigned exactly the way that Amy suggested. And, the question in the debate, who's the most important philosopher, Jesus Christ, and that was it. Nothing more, no explication about what that meant. It was there. But go back to 1980, and certainly there's no doubt Ralph is right that we had an explicitly, deeply evangelical, born-again Christian against somebody who wasn't religious at all, and we saw what happened with the votes. Why was that? It was issue positions. It was also rebellion against incompetence in the White House. I wouldn't want to run as a Republican this time, even though I'm not going to be running as George W. Bush, because the brand name it's like running as the next Enron at this point. And it's not going to be an easy thing to say that you're a candidate of change and yet keep your party, which still wants to be faithful to that. At the same time, this contrast just isn't going to be there unless it's Mike Huckabee. How are you going to set up a contrast, faith and non-faith, faith and secular, or issue positions reflecting Christian conservatives with Rudy Giuliani on the social issues against Hillary Clinton? It's a little tricky in this environment to set up faith, secular, issue positions and the like with Mitt Romney. You know, Mitt Romney is, here are my principles. If you don't like them, I've got others. And your faith is one that a whole lot of evangelicals are going to be very uneasy about, and clearly far more uneasy about than they would be about Orthodox Judaism. If you're Fred Thompson, I certainly don't see a message there at this point that reflects more than I'll be the first real law and order president.
Flo McAfee, would you like to respond?
Well, I think that's part of what happens in elections. And when you use the example of Rudy Giuliani and leading, because I think what happens is that the voters then start to separate and have their own dilemma of faith, and so the separation of state and church, they go with the public policy, and that's how sometimes they end up making their choices, their decisions, because when you use the example with Ronald Reagan, you're right, the whole faith issue, I always wondered about that, and this being this heavily faith-based country, Christian country, but yet to accept Ronald Reagan and for him to win. So I think what people did generally is they basically, the ties between religion and public policy, and at the end, it's politics, I think, part of it, and they go with in terms of their public policy, and that's where some of the choices, even those of faith, are made. Sometimes I think that happens, and that's why I think this next election coming up, depending on both the Republican and the Democratic nominee, are the choices going to boil down to their faiths? Will that be a part of it? But will it be strictly public policy, or will it be something else, depending on who the nominees are? And I say, for instance, if it's Hillary Clinton on the Democratic side, or if it's Obama, then are the dynamics, then we have a whole different thing that we need to look at here in this country, and that's something I think will change the whole conversation. And perhaps therein why Rudy Giuliani, So I question, as we approach this upcoming election, once we get to the nominees, how will it play out? Totally different, historically different.
Thanks, Flo. Rabbi Saperstein, do you have any response?
If I may, can I change the conversation a little bit on another part of the election question of religion? You began by asking the question about separation of church and state. I just want to clarify that it really doesn't apply to elections. Christians, Jews, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists have the right to say what they want, publish what they want. You could have a Christian party in the United States. There's really no limitation. It's only when you use government power to do things that you run into the problem of the Establishment Clause. But just because you have a right to do something doesn't make what you do right. I'm now working on a book, and I mention this because many of my colleagues here, many of you have done a lot of interesting thinking on this, and I'd love for you to be in touch with me about the use and abuse of religion in American elections. Trying to see, are there some guidelines that we can use to differentiate between what's appropriate, what's inappropriate, what's constructive, what's harmful to both religion and the commonweal and the American politic. And let me just in a minute try to lay out some markers. The dividing line's often fuzzy, but some markers there. I think when it comes to elections, it is constructive to use religion to help us understand who a candidate is. How can you understand a number of these candidates you've talked about in the past and present without understanding that what role religion plays in their life? I think it's important for them to speak about religious issues, free exercise issues, Establishment Clause issues, the very things we've talked about. We have a right to know where they feel on it. I think it is helpful when they illuminate how religion will affect their view on public policy, on foreign policy, on domestic policy. I think it is harmful when someone tries to make an argument for a public policy predominantly or exclusively in religious terms, because your statement of faith, I can't test in the free marketplace of ideas. In other words, our American system of government depends on a robust free marketplace of ideas that can have a public discourse. Secondly, there should be no religious test for office. The Constitution bans the government, but that wonderful, all of our favorite Republican President Teddy Roosevelt once argued that it is, even though it restrains only the government, candidates also ought to act in such a way as to never impose religious tests for office. In a speech to the Knights of Columbus, he made this argument. And I think that's absolutely true. And it shouldn't happen in a blatant way, in suggesting you have to be a certain religion. John McCain came close to that. Out of fairness, he didn't really make that argument explicitly. But in the context of the race, it had that resonance, and I think that's why people were so concerned about what he was saying. But it can happen indirectly. It's one thing I was honored when Joe Lieberman asked me to go on Nightline the night he was nominated to talk about how his religion, about his religious beliefs and how they would affect and how it might affect his being the vice president. But after a couple of months, he had done that. To raise it over and over again, I'm religious, I'm religious, I'm religious. It's not like I came from a poor background, I came from a poor background. It's conveying something about I'm better religiously than the other person in a way that suggests that's a criteria to vote on. And I think we have to be very careful about those kinds of things. And finally, I think there's a difference between inclusive religion and exclusive religion, inclusive rhetoric and exclusive rhetoric. Every religious statement is exclusive. Every religious statement, right? But in the civil religious traditions of America, the language of the Declaration of Independence and Martin Luther King and Abraham Lincoln has this inclusive component to it that sectarian, exclusive language clearly does not. And that kind of language is far more divisive of America. And I think on that spectrum, we ought to expect candidates to speak in the most inclusive language possible when they speak about what America ought to be. I don't have time to go into what I think religious groups should do and not do, and bishops should do and not do, which is another conversation. But I just wanted to lay out some of the parameters of what might be appropriate, inappropriate, constructive, or harmful.
Thanks. Seamus Hasson, do you have any thoughts on that?
I agree with surprisingly much of it. David and I have fun disagreeing with each other in public and have for years.
But we agree on a lot.
We do. We agree on much of that. Let me lob in a bit of history, some ancient history. 2 days after Jefferson wrote his Danbury Baptist letter, he attended church services on the floor of the House of Representatives, which is where the church services were held every Sunday, and brought along the Marine Band from the White House to accompany the hymns. Now, that meant that he was praying in a place where he couldn't possibly have thought that religious services belonged, in worship of somebody he most emphatically did not believe was God. To recognize that malleability of his principles on that side, and not to recognize it on his wall of separation metaphor, is to miss what was really going on with Jefferson. Jefferson was a free thinker in an age when free thinkers weren't all that welcome. And he was paddling on both sides of his canoe to get himself elected president in much the same way Bill Clinton, sang in the choir of televised church services to get himself elected. So to make Thomas Jefferson the patron anti-saint of this issue is for either side, is a mistake. One of the really amusing spectacles of the culture war is to watch the tug of war going on over Thomas Jefferson. Each side's got him by the arm and is trying to drag him into their camp and ignoring the profound differences between the private Jefferson and the public Jefferson. I think the lesson to draw from that, one lesson to draw from that, is that this has always been an area fraught with complexity, not to say ambiguity, and it's going to be that way for the foreseeable future. The rules of engagement that David proposes are interesting, and I'm sure he knows he's agreeing with John Courtney Murray in large measure in proposing public arguments, and I think it's a great step forward.
All right, at this point, I'd like to turn the panel over to Q&A from the audience. If anybody has any questions, you're free to come to the microphone.
Yeah, my name is Moses Stambler. I'm on the faculty, social work faculty at Southern Connecticut State University. I'd like to raise a question that relates to what David Kuo and Rabbi Saperstein have indicated. David Kuo, in your book, Tempting Faith, you've indicated essentially, as you have now, that government has invaded religion and that the government is manipulating religion for its own purposes, political purposes. The question I'm raising is this. How can religion maintain its independence given the fact that the welfare system, the social welfare system, has been broken down by the federal government? What we had before was a secular area and a religious area, and the government has removed the secular area and is pumping money into the religious areas. Since the 1996 and 2001 through executive orders, President Bush has been pumping money into religious agencies and is unaccountable for that to the people. The Heine versus Freedom for Religion of June 07, the court decision. Question, how can faith maintain its independent role when the government has continuously broken down the barriers between faith and welfare services and religion? I'm sorry, between faith and the secular services. What is the role of religion to maintain its independence?
Thank you for the question. Let me just say a couple things. One is, what I wrote about in the book was not government specifically invading faith. It was the temptation of politics to invade. The temptation that politics is for people of faith. I mean, and I wrote it both about myself and about what I experienced, through my life. So it really isn't specifically about government invading politics or invading the sacred. It really is about political elections in particular. So that's one thing. And then two, I'll turn it over to David in a second because he knows so much about this. But I will simply say that one of the great myths is, and the White House is really happy that you think this, by the way, is that funding of faith-based charities somehow began under President Bush. Funding of faith-based charities began decades and decades ago. Not too long ago, Ethel Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy's widow, said, well, we had faith-based charities. We just call them community organizations. What's the hubbub? And, it's part of my point. Catholic charities, United Jewish Communities, Lutheran Social Services, explicitly religious organizations have been receiving money from the federal government, from state government, from local government for decades. The American welfare system could not exist without these programs. And again, part of what happened, part of the great marketing of the Bush administration was to give the impression that this was something brand new. But in many ways, it was like starting a department of gravity and coming out and saying, look over there, New York now has gravity.
Let me just say very quickly, I stand with Richard Nathan and David Cole on this issue. I want to have a rich partnership between government and the faith communities. We've always had it, and I think we need it. And I think there are lots of ways we can constitutionally strengthen it. The Supreme Court has always upheld government funding of the religious activities in which religious organizations express their religious faith primarily through the provision of social services. That's always been upheld by the courts. The court, even the Rehnquist court, never upheld direct government funding of institutions whose primary purpose is is the conveyance of religious, educational, ritual activity, etc. So houses of worship, parochial schools, the court has never upheld that. I think that's a good distinction, and I think it's one that should be upheld because with government money, this goes to your point, because government rules, regulations, monitoring, interference, control, and the temptation of those primarily faith-driven organizations to modify their agenda to get the government money and to get the government approval. So I think there are real risks in changing this. I will only say I really believe the fifth vote is now on the Supreme Court to make that change. I think we're looking at a brave new world coming up in which 2 years from now this is going to be a very kind of different discussion, and I have no idea what that world's going to look like and how much damage it's going to end up doing to both religion and politics.
Thank you.
I'm Michael Lindsay. My question's for Amy and for Eric. I don't think there's a huge difference between Democratic presidential candidates and Republican presidential candidates in terms of expressions of faith on the whole. If you look at the last 30 years, Bill Clinton, Jimmy Carter, Al Gore, a variety of different candidates, Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, can talk about their faith in a genuine, authentic way. The difference, it seems to me, between Republicans and Democrats on this issue is not so much in the candidates, it's in their administrations and their campaigns and the people who are in those senior advisory roles. Because when I was doing my research trying to identify those folks who served in the executive branch, who I started off just trying to find people of faith. I ended up narrowing it to evangelicals. But when I really was starting out on people of faith, there was a really long list of folks who had served in Republican administrations. But in Democratic administrations, I had a hard time. And even when I knew the people, I mean, Flo knows this, even when I would go to the people, they were afraid to talk about it, in the Democratic team. And so it seems to me that the issue is not so much about the presidential candidate as much as it is about the way in which the administration works. The reasons why it seems to me that evangelicals liked Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush is because they were willing to appoint people into their campaigns in senior positions that shared some of their kind of faith. And then in the process, when it came time they were actually elected into office, they also appointed people to senior administrative posts who shared their faith. And I'm wondering if you think Democrats still have that issue to grapple with, or is it a new day?
It's true that one of the things I often tell people is it's not that Democratic voters are any less religious than Republican voters. It's not that Democratic politicians are any less religious than Republican politicians. It's the people in that very small group, but that important, influential group who run the national parties and to some extent some of the state parties. And there you do see a difference. I think some of it is what I talked about at lunch with people still in the closet. And so when you think you're the only one, you are much less likely to speak up, even though if you did, you would find other people coming out of the woodwork to back you up. But it is true that in general, the people who staff Democratic campaigns both come from backgrounds where they weren't necessarily exposed to religion, but have been living perhaps on the East Coast long enough that they really do think the base of their party would be offended by appeals to religious voters, which I think we can all argue about, but I would say it's not true. The one exception to this, and I think it's an important exception that Flo and I have talked about, is the Clinton administration, which was a marriage of, whatever you think about Bill Clinton, he's a religious guy, a very sincere Baptist who knows his Bible better than anybody, probably anybody who's ever served in that office. And yet he was surrounded by senior staff people who were everyone from Paul Begala, the pro-life conservative Christian, to John Podesta, who's also Catholic, or Paul Begala is Catholic, George Stephanopoulos, whose father is a Greek Orthodox priest. He had Flo in there, Rahm Emanuel, just a whole variety of people, and they weren't selected because of their religion. But what was interesting is they didn't act as a stop. So when he says, I'd like to sit down for 3 hours with Christianity Today and do an interview with them, nobody says, ooh, that doesn't sound like a good idea. Or when he says, I think religious liberty is a good idea. I think we should do something about coming up with rules for how to talk about religion in public school. Nobody stepped in and said, that really doesn't sound like something we want to do. And so it was the perfect marriage, I think, of a politician who already had that motivation and that perspective with staff who were willing to just help him out with it for the most part.
Just echo, staff are vitally important. And the way you pose it sounds almost like it's the patronage issue that people are looking for. And I agree with Amy. It's not that, we appointed this leader, figurehead, and look, they're important now. It's that when those people are in the staff, they don't stop things. They also know how to reach out. And, religious communities, it's about community. It's about relationship. And whereas before, Democrats had been absolutely, we don't want to come near an evangelical because they're scary. When they start meeting with them, when they start reaching out, which is what Obama and Clinton especially have been doing in spades, both sides realize that there's a lot more in common than they thought. They start seeing each other as people instead of as caricatures. The rhetoric comes down a little bit, and that's what leads to the success. And that is a shift that is definitely happening within the party, not only at the staff level, but then in some of the leadership. What the party's been doing is raising up people who are authentic people of faith to say, we've got this problem. You all have been telling us we've had this problem for a while, so help us fix it, and we will empower you at very senior levels to do so. In the House, the head of the caucus, you've got inner circle people in Clinton and Obama's campaign, etc. That is a culture shift that I think is much more important than patronage of putting key people in. I know Flo has another
Flo,
important perspective.
since you served as a religious liaison.
And I also think, as both said, some of us were the quiet voices, because I'm sure much more knew about David in the Bush administration than me, and part of it was just, my faith is my entire life. And the other thing that we can't forget is that the Democratic Party has always had, with African Americans, we've been one of faith, whether it's been invisible, but we have been there. And most of the politicians that came, African American politicians, came out of the church. Now, whether some feel it's authentic, your whole life, many have felt it's authentic. Now, we have those that, as they say, the media have. There are certain ones that have been selected, whether it's a Jesse Jackson or an Al Sharpton, but there have been a lot in the whole base. So it's been there. Perhaps we just have not amplified and made everybody aware of the folks there, but it's been there, so that's a slight difference.
I'm Ben Johnson. I'm at the law school here. So Eric said something earlier about how he thought it was perfectly fine for Democrats to take their faith and let that inform their policy. But probably 10 years ago or so, Justice Stevens came up with this novel idea that there was a First Amendment establishment right to abortion. That even though, and then John Kerry took this up in 2004, and he started saying that, well, even though I personally believe that abortion is wrong, I come to that as a religious belief, and therefore I can't let this affect my policy because that would be against First Amendment. He didn't go a week without then making basically a public speech that I believe, because I'm a Catholic and I believe in social justice, that we must have social security policies and we must have universal health care, and this is a Christian commitment and my faith leads me to this. So my questions are for Amy and then Ralph. Why didn't you call him on this, or you, the media? Why didn't somebody just get up there and say, this is ridiculous? And Ralph, why didn't somebody, why wasn't this like a campaign issue? This kind of blatant hypocrisy on the way that people are just going to and Republicans do this too, I must say, but this was the one that I noted that just drove me out of my mind. And so how come people aren't picking up on these kind of dichotomies?
Well, I guess we've been accused of a lot of things. I didn't know going easy on John Kerry was one of them. But I'm glad somebody thinks that.
You wuss.
No, I think that as a general rule, I think as a, just from a campaign strategy standpoint, I don't know if it's a good idea to question someone else's explication of their own understanding of how their faith informs their public policy views. So we would criticize objectively his public policy views, whether it was, voting to send the troops to war and then voting not to give them the body armor, for example. That was a criticism. We certainly criticized his flip-flops, and things like that. But if somebody gets up and says, well, as a Catholic or as a Protestant, or if Mitt Romney ultimately does give what some people think will be sort of his version of the JFK speech, probably better to just let it lie, and to that point, Norm mentioned that sort of now famous moment when the president was asked, in the Iowa debate by Tom Brokaw, who's your favorite philosopher? And if you recall, he actually did elaborate on it. Because, when he said it, everybody was so shocked, including, by the way, everybody in the campaign. I mean, I can assure you, anybody who's ever done debate prep, you don't expect that question, and you sure don't know what he's going to say. You just hope it's not Karl Marx, in a Republican primary. And so Brokaw said, well, explain yourself. What do you mean? And this was my favorite part. The president said, if I have to explain it to you, then you don't understand it. It was, it was his way of saying, look, it's a very personal, he changed my soul, he changed my heart. And so the answer to your question is, if it's authentic, number one, let the candidate say it. But number two, remember, he or she's going to say it anyway. I mean, you get out there in this environment with those boom mics and YouTube and everything else, and let me tell you, who you are is going to come through. And that's why it worked for Bush, not because somebody handed him a blue card. I mean, it was like when he got asked, what's the biggest mistake you ever made? And he said, when I traded Sammy Socha to the Chicago Cubs. It was just who he was.
I'm a Texan. That was a big mistake.
Nobody had to make it up.
Three quick things. One was that I think it was the follow-up that Bush made that was the problem, because he was basically saying to everyone, which is a lot of Americans, who didn't have that same personal experience, that I'm not going far enough to explain it to you. You're either like me or you're not. Whereas Gary Bauer got the same question. He said Jesus Christ, and he explained it's because of Matthew 25. I feel I'm supposed to be caring for people. And he went through how it informed his public policy. I think that's a requirement for you as a politician if you're going to bring it up, and it's a requirement for people in my profession to follow up if people don't. You don't just let a statement like that stand. So it's right to have a follow-up question. All too often journalists don't follow up with questions. As for why people went easy on John Kerry, I'm a little confused, I have to admit, because I don't think there was a week when I didn't hear people going after him as a cafeteria Catholic. And I certainly know I saw that in media coverage of, why is he focusing on his faith in these areas, but then he's hands off on abortion. And the third point of that would be, I think there's been a problem with Catholics in the Democratic Party misinterpreting JFK's 1960 speech for a long, long time. It was made slightly worse by someone I admire a lot, Mario Cuomo, in his 1984 speech, and that, I think, is what Kerry was trying to do again. But it's interesting, over the last few years, and I think we'll see more of this, we're starting to see a new generation of Catholics who have come into politics just in the last few years. And so they're not kind of scared to death like the previous generations of Catholic Democrats have been. And what they say is, I'm pro-life, and here's what I'm going to do about it. Not, well, I'm personally pro-life, but hands off, I'm a politician, so I can't do anything. They're saying, like Governor Bill Ritter out in Colorado, I'm pro-life, and that's why I'm going to work to reduce abortion rates. Here are the policies I'm actually going to support in order to do something about abortion. And that's a way of connecting his Catholic faith and his opposition to abortion and his role as a public official.
Thanks, Amy. Unfortunately, we're now out of time for answers, but you can feel free to ask the question if you'd like. So we are going to have another panel after this, and there's hand raised.
I'll ask my statement, or ask my statement. I guess that's how it'll be. Going back to the identity and voting question, and we've at Christianity Today have thought a lot about how evangelical identity affects voting behavior. My feeling is that it's a lot less important that the candidate is like you as an evangelical, so much as that he likes you as an evangelical. That there is a certain, some might see it as an insecurity, but there's at least I don't care if you're an evangelical yourself, but if you don't like me, if you don't like that I'm an evangelical, then, or if there's any kind of animosity towards that, even more than the hiring decisions, even more than some of the other stuff, if you're willing to be seen with me, that trumps almost anything else. So I was wondering if some of you on both sides would respond to that, but I guess I'll have to catch you at the break. Thanks.
Well, I was going to ask the panel to respond to the fact that as a Southern Baptist, I have noted that 4 out of the last 5 times that Southern Baptists have had an opportunity, they have voted against a Southern Baptist for someone who was not a Southern Baptist. In 1980, 2 out of 3 voted against Jimmy Carter. In 92 and 96, they voted more voted against Clinton than voted for him. And in 2000, it was 4 out of 5 Southern Baptists voted against a Southern Baptist who was not only a Southern Baptist, but a Sunday school teacher and a regular attender in Al Gore. So it seems that there are other things in play besides denominational affiliation, and I'd just like to know. Would have liked to know what the panel thought about it.
Thank you. At this point, we're going to close the panel.